Hi, folks, with Tassus today. Tassus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the decline of, in this case, British manufacturing and industry generally, that was already clearly in evidence in the 1960s and accelerated very much into the 1970s and beyond. In fact, still in a state of decline today, what's left of it. Now, there's a few interesting things to consider here. There are a lot of think tanks, a lot of policymakers, a lot of people were bending their minds around and putting their energies towards, well, how do we rejuvenate British industry? How do we get it back into being the world competitive industry it once was? Now, British industry hasn't really been competitive in certainly most sectors for quite a long time. The last time the British industry was quite clearly competitive on an international stage was really in the 1880s. Since that time, it's been in really a gradual decline, which of course picked up pace after the end of World War II. So what were these policymakers thinking? What were they saying was the problem with why was British industry not competitive on an international stage? Or I mean, some sectors it might have been, but why was British industry in decline? Why were factories closing? Why were factories unable to compete with imports and so on and so forth? So now these are all valid questions. If manufacturing and industry is in decline, you ask the questions, well, why is it in decline? And then follow from that, well, what can we do to arrest that decline or indeed turn it around so that British industry does become competitive again? Now, there are quite a lot of things that go into this. It's not simply a matter of, are British workers lazy or not lazy? Or, it's not just that. There's things to do with international exchange rates. Many would argue that the British pound was overvalued during the time, which made British exports more expensive, but allowed imports to be less expensive by contrast. So there are all sorts of issues to do with exchange rates. There was a lot of very militant trade unions that were demanding all sorts of things, and I'll come back to that in a minute because it's relevant in some ways, ideologically at least, to what's going on today around the world. But also, British management was very much caught up in a class struggle, the elites versus the working classes. Also, a lot of the British managers were from the exalted class and weren't necessarily skilled. They hadn't worked their way through the business or the company. They'd been parachuted into the top level merely because they had the right breeding and the right background. Not all of them, of course, but many. So there are a whole lot of factors that went into industrial decline. But when the thinkers and the policy makers and the think tanks got together and thought about it, and I've looked at their papers and their ruminations, if you like, from back in the day, and they all seem to come more or less to the same view that really the reason that industry was declining, and you were starting to already see the equivalent of what the Rust Belt in the United States was. Already those Rust Belts were appearing in the English Midlands and north into places like Sheffield, which had previously been considered, poster boys and children for the British industry, British steel and the like. They were all in decline. Factories were closed and empty and so on. And no one really knew what to do. But their policy makes it, well, the reason for this is wages are too high. The reason British industry is not competitive, wages are too high, and the workers, are so set in their ways in terms of industrial militancy and fighting the upper classes, this sort of thing, that it's almost impossible to do anything until we can address both these issues. How do we address these issues of high wages and class militancy? Well, it's easy. We've got an easy answer at hand. We'll just import third world peasants from Pakistan. They've got massive surplus population, massive unemployment there. So we'll just import workers from Pakistan, cheap peasant slave labor, serf labor, we'll just import that. That'll fix everything. Everything will now be fixed. We bypass the industrial class militancy. We bypass the high wages. Bingo, a land of golden milk and honey will appear, and all will be well. And just by this push button fix, we just pull a lever and we're all good to go. Now, we can look back now and be astonished at the naivety of this, but and the stupidity of it. And these were supposedly some of the best minds and some of the best brains around were coming up, or supposedly again coming up with this sort of thing. So I just want to look at both sides of this argument, this view, this position, this attitude of the day. Now, remember, we're going back 50 years, even more than 50 years on this. And every prescription that was being put forward was around how do we lower wages and bypass this industrial militancy. Not that they weren't issues, they were, but this was the fixation on this was absolute. There was no other possible solution. Any other solution was merely an incidental byproduct. This was where the action was to be. This was where it's going to be solved. This was the hill to die on, and anyone that disagreed just was an idiot or was probably a militant labor unionist or something like that. So bear in mind, at the time, the government of the left and the right were very different from ideological perspectives. It wasn't until the 1980s when they all arrived on pretty much the same page and all began to follow the earlier iterations of the globalist script. And these were people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and so on. And the policy prescriptions were really very much being developed at this time, which later on were being imposed. We can look back now and say, well, these things never were the answer. They never were going to solve any problems. There were other factors at work here. And by solving one factor, or seeming to solve one factor, importing cheap slave, third world slave labor, that actually doesn't solve any problem. And the wages and the militancy were more a symptom rather than a cause. So now, looking at the union side of the industrial militancy of the day, bear in mind that pretty much every trade unionist in Britain worth their salt had gone to Moscow, the Soviet Union, the communist sort of center of the universe. They'd gone to the Soviet Union to get industrial militancy training and how to, subversion training and agitator training and so on. And so they were, and much to the delight of the communists, these people were sent back to the West for the sole purpose of deliberately subverting British industry and breaking British morale and workers' morale and creating, agitating for confrontation and discord and so on. But some of the interesting things, if you look at the speeches and be they written, some of them written down, the concept of compensation was already alive and well, which we see today that's been passed on to lesbians and trans and black people and so on. They've just transferred it from class to race, gender hustling. But it's the same argument. So you're looking at the workers in say Northern England, the industrial heartland, what then was the industrial heartland of England, and areas going from manufacturing, coal mining, and so on. So they were. Here's one sort of speech. My grandfather died of coal dust poisoning in the mines. Now this guy's a man already in his 50s. In 1971, he was saying this. So, my grandfather died of coal mining dust when he was only in his 40s. We've got to make these companies pay, and they've been oppressing us for centuries. Do you know what they did in the 1700s to workers going down the mines? What these people did? They did such a thing, and we've got to make them pay. We're not going to take this anymore. We're going to get those motherfuckers to pay up, and we're going to teach them a lesson, and they can't. And so there's very much this idea of compensation for past grievances and perceived past injustices. And the fact that someone's grandfather or great-grandfather may have died by working in, whether they did or not, I don't know. Why is that an issue today when there are a plethora of safety protocols in place, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot of these speeches, and quite a lot of the agitation, industrial agitation, constantly made these references to past injustices going back 2, 3, 4, 5, or even more generations. Now, if you compare that to the black agitators wanting compensation for slavery or black oppression or something, particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere now, the blacks in the Caribbean are also jumping on that bandwagon. Their arguments are exactly the same. Past injustice, we have to be compensated for past injustices for people who are long dead. And that was the same argument being used by the miners and the industrialists, or the trade union agitators, at least. Now they also got some column inches in some of the newspapers where they made, this is the unionists, they made more or less the same argument. So you can, if you're a factory owner or a policy maker who's been to all the right schools and the right universities, you would look at this with horror and you say, well, these guys just a rabble. They're intractable. They're impossible to do business with. Why should we sit down and negotiate with these feral low-life creatures? We'll just get some compliant peasants from Pakistan, and we're all good to go. We don't have to deal with them anymore. And you can see how that thinking sort of blossomed over time, and we see the great replacement theory. Meaning, not only are these people industrial militants wanting things, but we've got people now who want things like free and fair elections. Oh no! Independent courts, courts of law, incorruptible courts of law. We don't have that. We're not going to do business with those. It's the extension of the same argument, but instead of just looking at industrial and manufacturing policy, it's now that attitude of contempt for the working classes, sneering contempt, by the way, that you saw reflected back then on the industrial stage, manufacturing, has now extended to things like democracy. And so why do we have to share the table with these people at all? We can just import brown and black people and fuck them. We don't have to piss on that lot anymore, which is, you could see already the embryonic attitude to that, but confined to again, industrial policy today, but now is complete social policy, international Western social and economic and crowd management policy all across the Western world now. But that was evident back then in that late 1960s, early 1970s period. Looking at the issue of how could British industry be made competitive? Again, there's a whole lot of things, including international exchange rates, level of technology, automation, you name it. Now, the union was very much about not only protecting jobs, but protecting standard of living. And this was difficult in Britain at the time, given the sort of inflationary pressures that they were under, because there was constant catch-up type pay rises. But mines that were non-economical, the big finances, if you like, the big international cartels, they didn't want to keep these mines open. Now, they could have made the mines viable by going full bore with automation, but that would mean they'd have to lay off half the workforce. The unions resisted this viciously and with some success for quite a while, by the way. Many governments caved into union demands. The union demands became unrealistic and impractical and quite shrill, and so we want to keep completely unprofitable, uneconomic, unproductive mines open, and we want to have overmanning and overstaffing to the nth degree. So if the mine only needed 500 workers, the unions would insist that they had to have 2,000 and so on. On top of this, much industrial policy was being determined by interfering governments, saying, well, we'll subsidise your industry with taxpayer money, but you have to open a factory in an area with high unemployment. Now, it turns out that factory had bad roads. It had no rail, connections for transporting things around. It was far from any market. It was far from any raw materials. It was very expensive to operate in that area, and so on. But that was the price for subsidy. So as the British government took a bigger role in subsidising various industries, they also took a much bigger role in deciding policy and stacking boards of directors with flunkies and stooges who were there not necessarily, well, in fact, hardly at all, to make the industry or the factory or the business successful. They were focusing on their own feather bedding, and they're also focusing on things like the political aspirations, where if the factory manager comes and look, I've got 10,000 workers, I only need 2,000 workers. I got to lay off 8,000 workers. The government would go into a blind panic because they would realise what bad headlines they would get and how they would lose an election or something like that. So they would insist, no, those 10,000 workers have to stay. So a lot of politics were going. So the very policymakers that were prescribing how to or coming up with ideas or suggestions or policies to supposedly arrest the decline were themselves very active in accelerating that decline, because they were making political and ideological type decisions that they were imposing on the business or on the factory or on the industry. So they bypassed the things that could have been done, such as the automation and so on. Similarly, the quality of management was an issue. Say in motor vehicle production, the quality of management couldn't have. I mean, if you went and said, "Look, I want you to get the least qualified managers that we can almost guarantee will fuck it up royally, and we want to put them in charge," it's almost like they did that. And not that you can't see the intentions weren't to fuck it up. You're just looking at incompetent people that don't realise the realities of what they're doing. So they'll decide to build a car, for example, that they're going to build to a certain price. Now the threshold of price is declining. The Japanese are producing better quality cars at a lower price all the time. That's your competition. So you don't build a car that in advance cannot compete with that price movement. So instead, you build a car with less features, less reliability, shoddy workmanship and quality of finish, and you build it to a price that's higher than that. And the reason the price often was higher, because they would go a certain way along the design or even the manufacturing process, then say, we forgot that the car had to actually be retailed at a lower price than we thought. Oh, okay, well, that's no problem. Why don't we just do this and this? And that'll fix the price. Okay, you fixed the price problem, but now you've got a quality and reliability problem. The two parts that you're trying to put together here are incompatible. So you're going to have endless maintenance and operational problems out in it. But that doesn't matter because we solved the price problem. And this was very much the attitude of the management generally. Well, we'll look at the most pressing problem. If we solve that, then we've done our job. But what about all these other problems you're creating? Yeah. And this became the attitude of British industry, and quite an international reputation, by the way, for that. So for that crazy fix this problem but leave the others, or fix this problem with amplify other problems and so on, that became a catch cry of British industry and how they were viewed. And I'm sort of going around Germany years ago, when I was just a kid, and that I mentioned something about British industry came up. The whole room erupted in laughter. Such was the sneering contempt that they had for British workmanship and quality of engineering and so on. It was that bad, and I assume would be worse today. So the things that could have been done weren't done, and so the decline was inevitable under such circumstances. We look back now and it looks so obvious. You think, well, why didn't the people at the time think it? But they became fixated on this idea, as I say, of high wages are the problem, industrial militancy. Not that those weren't issues, they were. But the idea that everything could be solved if we solve that, and the solution is to bring in Pakistani, illiterate peasant Pakistanis to fix it. So their view was, if we can just get really low wages, lowest of the low wages, we can just get low wages, and we can get people that aren't caught up in British class industrial militancy, that goes back centuries. If we can get rid of those issues as obstacles, then everything else will just magically fall into place. That was the attitude they took. Now, that overall attitude of, if we just get rid of the local people, just get them out the way and replace them with others, then all the problems will go. That attitude still prevails today, although instead of just being an industry, it's crept into everything. Democracy, government, law courts, everything. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.